Today on The Future of Everything, the future of virtual technologies. So with the onset of COVID pandemic and the associated social distancing rules, the use of virtual technologies has exploded for communication. Many people whose job allowed it worked at home and attended meetings on video conference. Many workplaces accelerated their use of software for communication during the day with platforms that support messaging, scheduling, task management, project tracking, all that kind of stuff. Now, teachers at all levels of education attempted to teach their students using computational technologies. This was difficult and with varying success, but they tried. Healthcare professionals moved much of their practice to a virtual setting. I think many people were surprised. I myself have had appointments with a primary care physician, a physical therapist, and a dermatologist, all remotely, and all of those went pretty well. One of them needed to see me and said, get in here right away. And so I did. These technologies also became important, obviously, for not just work, but for keeping contact with friends and family. You can hang out, you can have a virtual happy hour, and you can see your loved ones even when you're not allowed to be there in person. So one example for me is at the start of the pandemic, my father resided in an independent living community in Queens, New York. And in order to protect the residents, because this was a hotbed of COVID in March, April, May of 2020, they allowed no visitors, including me, except for the home and health aides. So my father was confined to his apartment where they delivered meals and tried to keep him safe. Now, he died in February of 2021, unrelated to COVID, but for that 12, 13 months, my only way of interacting with my dad was over this video chat device where I could call him without him answering. He would not have been able to answer it just because of his capabilities, but I could just drop in and say, hey, Dad, and we would talk. And I'm incredibly grateful to the company that developed this technology, without which I would have had 13 months without my dad seeing me, without me seeing my dad. So we all have had different experiences of these virtual technologies. Sometimes we love them, sometimes we hate them. Kayvon Fatahalian is a professor of computer science at Stanford University. He works on advanced computer graphics and visual algorithms. He focuses on efficient processing of images and videos and hardware, software to improve these systems. Kayvon, as someone deep into these technologies underlying many platforms that have become household words for virtual meetings, gatherings, and the rest, what is your assessment of what we've learned in the last 2 years, and where are we going with all this?
Oh man! Well, first of all, Russ, thanks for having me on. So, I think it's a very, I won't say exciting, I will say a very important time to get all this stuff right. Yeah. In that, like, my history as a computer graphics researcher has always been about building platforms and tools to help people create new virtual experiences. And those virtual experiences, they were computer games, or maybe they were movies or other things in the past. And when the pandemic hit, a bunch of us, it just got like, well, wait a minute here. It is time for us to step up, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's why I've been excited about this, because like you said in your intro, like everybody is touching this stuff all the time right now. Yeah. And so I feel for computer graphics, this is, we just kind of got thrown this responsibility to try and take everything that we've learned about interacting in virtual spaces and try and improve all these areas of normal day-to-day life now that you just talked about.
So this is fascinating because it suggests, I think what you just said is, this was not your primary focus before the pandemic, but you felt almost like a call that you had to now put attention into this, a kind of more human communication as opposed to other goals of computer graphics.
I mean, I think everybody, any professor at Stanford is going to say the goal is to have impact, right? And I think this was a situation where we all got thrown into it immediately in our own day-to-day lives because we had 1 or 2 weeks to figure out a teaching plan to deliver lectures to all these students. And some folks have been like, oh my gosh, this is gonna be terrible. We've seen around the university, other folks have been incredibly sort of open and innovative and just trying a bunch of stuff. Yeah. And I think folks have learned that sometimes the virtual world can be better for some things than what we were doing in the past. And I think that exists not just, for us teaching, but it exists in many other fields as well. And so I kind of think about the problem at hand is, how do we figure out how to use these new technologies, not to substitute or replace what we were doing in person, but to use them kind of as a new medium that you use in different ways. Like, for example, if I'm watching a football game on the radio, that broadcaster is announcing the game very different than what a TV announcer would do.
Yes.
And so I think that the folks that have embraced this, I can't do what I was doing before, but I could do something a little bit differently, and it might be better in some respects, have really stumbled upon some things. And as a computer scientist, the goal for me is, what are the tools that we need to build to make those experiences more successful or richer? And this is something we've only just begun thinking about, but I'd love to sort of sound the bullhorn, a little bit for the conversation.
So you mentioned that some things might have actually gotten better. So can you give me an example? I think you've written and talked a little bit about your teaching experiences. You've seen some positives in the teaching coming out of the use of virtual technologies that maybe people would not have expected.
No question. And like, for example, in the class that myself and my co-teacher Kunle Olukutun have delivered a couple times during the pandemic. Now we do it all virtually. This year we're actually doing our office hours in person again, because we're not trying to replace everything.
Right.
But if I'm lecturing to a cohort of 100 or more Stanford students in a course that is recorded already, I think many professors at Stanford, whether they be good professors or bad professors, will tell you that classroom thins out by the end of the quarter. And so what we're seeing is that if you can watch that lecture from your bedroom in your pajamas, you show up for the live synchronous lecture. If you're not required to keep your camera on, but you can ask me questions via text chat or via a question board, you're going to be more likely to ask questions, especially if you're someone who's inherently a little bit shy or a little bit intimidated to be in that classroom. We've found that something as simple as giving the students the ability to light up the screen with emojis to react to what I'm saying gets more students to just watch because it's interesting.
It becomes a spectacle.
And is the replacement of the visual eye contact that any good speaker is always looking for to sort of riff on the audience. But instead of eye contact, where I might be going, is that person looking at me funny because someone just texted them something unrelated to the class? The class just organically has developed a vocabulary of emojis. When people are confused, certain emojis light up the screen. When people want me to stop. So I actually feel like I am more in touch with my audience, again, when that audience is above 100 students already, than I would be if I was in the classroom, especially listening to seeing a very sparse class.
That is really interesting, because as a lecturer myself on occasion, I know that getting the temperature of the audience, so to speak, and seeing whether this is clicking or not is huge. And when you said people turning off their camera, I immediately get worried that, well, then how am I going to read the crowd, so to speak? But it sounds like you've developed ways, and there were ways in these technologies that could be kind of harnessed for that feedback to you as the lecturer, and that it was effective.
Exactly. And the way to think about it is identify the things that you need. You need feedback. You need to understand the temperature of the people in the auditorium. So think about how digital technologies could begin to solve that, or to address that problem. And a lot of folks have said, well, in the real world, it's because I look at people's faces.
Right.
And that's the mechanism that I have. But if you're sitting in a digital platform, you have the opportunity to have a bunch of other mechanisms that in some situations may be better, right?
Great. So I'm good. So that's really good starting point. And I'm going to guess, however, that as a professional in this area, especially on the technology side, you are not completely satisfied with these technologies. So what do you see as the big, either technical or perhaps social challenges, or perhaps both, that need to be addressed in order to bring things to the next level of performance?
I'm going to answer your question a little bit roundabout way. What do most people say? So most things that I hear are one of two answers at the far poles of this. You have a bunch of folks, and like I'm a computer graphics guy, some of these are my friends, is we're going to solve this with technology. When we have VR headsets and high resolution VR headsets, and we can all live in a virtual world and achieve presence, that's when things will be great.
Okay.
The other side is, this is just a stopgap. I cannot wait to get to 2022 when we're all back together and things go back to normal.
Right.
Right. And I sort of reject both of those. Right. I think about it as, there are some very simple mechanisms that in our experimentation we figured out, and I'm sure other people can come up with more, but they're fairly low tech. But the biggest thing tends to be, can you customize the experience, the interface, the user experience for the task at hand? So my auditorium that I teach in, my virtual auditorium, is probably going to look different than the one that's best for you, because you have a different teaching style, you have different rapport with your students. And so that's one way that the virtual can be better, is that I basically get to design the classroom that I teach in for my class's needs. And that's not something that we can do if we're in a physical classroom at Stanford. We're spending half our time trying to figure out where the HDMI cable is, right?
Yeah, and I'm in a bioengineering department where some of us, like I'm on the computational side, so it's very cerebral and it's very computational and it happens at a screen. But I have colleagues teaching electronics and instrumentation where you have to build stuff, and other ones who are doing biological experiments with test tubes and stuff, and they have entirely different needs. And how well served are the more physical, like mechanical engineering folks by these technologies?
I think that's something that's I do not teach those classes. I teach a little.
Nor do I.
Computer, and so I don't think I can speak super intelligently about that. I think that their needs are going to be very different, and it'll be very interesting to hear what they have figured out over the last month or so.
So in reviewing some of the papers that you guys have written and some of the work you've done, it's really quite, you have this idea of visual computing. And one of the phrases that appears in one of your presentations is render everything you have ever seen. So I want to pull back a little bit and say, what are the capabilities of photography, image creation, video, and then analysis of all that stuff that is coming down the pike, that is going to give us new tools that maybe even will be helpful to our colleagues who are teaching physical stuff that needs 3 dimensions and things like. Are we headed towards VR, or are there a lot of other options? VR, what I mean by that is virtual reality with the headset, as you discussed.
Right. Yeah. So that quote, which I must have pulled in some talk, is that's I would attribute that back to the original folks at Pixar, which was their mantra, which was when they were developing some of the earliest graphics algorithms, like the world was, our goal is to be able to render anything the eye can see. And if I had to wind that forward 30 years, sort of what's the question now? And actually one of the questions is kind of, we want to interpret anything the human eye could ever have seen, and we want to interpret it in computing devices. And so I think that, for example, AR is about to be the big rage,
And so what's AR?
Augmented reality as opposed to virtual reality, right? So, the last couple of years, there was a huge amount of interest in VR in the industry. AR is the next big. And I think that the harder problem, as opposed to how do we build amazing headsets and displays, is how can we interpret the world intelligently enough to know what to put on that display to make it useful in the real world. And that's where folks like my colleagues in computer vision are making great progress. But that's a tricky problem that I think that folks are really gonna have to put some thought into. If you can build this display, what do you put on it? We've had examples of Google Glass, for example, where people were wearing that around, and it was a really innovative technology, but people couldn't quite figure out how to integrate that in their daily lives. So I think that's the real challenge that we're facing on.
Yeah. So for this segment, we have a couple of minutes, and I wanted to turn a little bit to issues that people might not think of in terms of so I love this issue that you just raised of like, what should be rendered, what alternative or augmented information can we give in a visual field to help somebody in the job that they're doing or in the fun that they're having. do the issues of ethics and justice and equity of access, do these come up in the field, or are those really something to consider once the technologies are kind of a little bit more mature, and then society has a larger discussion about how to use them and who gets to use them and stuff like that? Where is that discussion, or is it happening?
The discussion should be happening from day one. And it's not, it doesn't always in all groups,
right.
But if you're trying to have impact, by definition, you have some responsibility, right? And in particular in computer graphics, that is starting to rear its head all over the place right now. So we can render images. We've kind of achieved this goal of rendering everything the eye can see. And these days, with some of these deep learning technologies, we can render or we can manipulate things that actually happened in real life. So in that sense, also in the sense that we can record almost everything. What should be recorded and what should not be recorded are big questions. So the conversation has not happened enough. Often it happens too late. Often when it happens too late, to be fair, it's a bit reactionary and also not necessarily the right conversation to have. So we had a project, it was called the Stanford Cable TV News Analyzer. Just to give you one example, and this is on the web, anybody can.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about that. So this is a great introduction.
And so what we did was, with the help of the Internet Archive and some colleagues at Stanford, Manish Agrawala and Geraldine Moriba from the JSK Fellows Program, we basically downloaded all of the videos from Fox, MSNBC, and CNN since about 2010 up until present day, and we're still doing that every day. And we said, well, computer vision has gotten to the state where some of the simple analyses that are doing painstakingly by hand by various media watchdogs or other organizations
or interns
we can just do. We can easily grab the transcripts. We can easily detect the faces. We can use technologies, controversial technologies like Amazon's face recognition technology, to know who is on screen. And we can even go as far to potentially make some assessment of the presented binary gender of those individuals if someone is interested in asking questions about gender representation. So in what I just said, you probably could have stopped me at 4 points in that statement and said, wait a minute here, are you sure you want to be doing that? And so we have spent a good amount of time talking to folks, to stakeholders, to people that might be able to see some of our blind spots or advise us on, should you be doing that? And there have been lengthy conversations, and we have made a set of decisions about that. And we can talk about those decisions later or not, but.
Absolutely. In fact, let me stop you there as we go into the end of this segment, and we'll take this up next. This is The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Professor Kayvon Fatahalian about virtual reality, communications, and now what do we see when we analyze media? Next on SiriusXM. Welcome back to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Professor Kayvon Fatahalian, and we're talking about a lot of things, but most recently, we just started hearing about this fascinating project where for 10 years or more, you've been capturing, not just capturing the video on CNN, Fox, and I think you said MSNBC, but also analyzing it for who's there, what they're saying, and even features of the speakers and of the reporters and perhaps of the people who are being reported on. So you brought this up in the context of my question about the ethical issues that arise. And so I just wanted to play that out because we ran out of time in the last segment. Tell me about the analyses. How do you choose what to do with this data? Who has access to it? And how do you kind of steward it so that it's a force for good?
Right. All great questions. So the types of analyses that we were doing, we were interested in asking the question, like, who gets the most screen time on a particular show? So we did a number of analyses of the 2020 election cycle, for example, where you could see that Biden was talked about all the time, but actually Biden did not appear on screen very much, which is a common property of the front runner. Everybody that was trying to catch Biden was, their representatives were trying to get themselves on every talk show that you could think of. So those are some of the trends that came out. To your question, another trend was there's this project run by the BBC that's trying to analyze and get to gender parity in their broadcast. And so we use some off-the-shelf computer vision techniques to try and estimate the binary presenting gender of the news presenters. And that analysis showed that the ratio on average over the last decade is about 2 to 1, men to women.
Men to women, 2 to 1.
In screen time. And it hasn't moved very much over the last decade.
That's also really
It has actually gone from about 2.3 to 1 to about 1.9 to 1 in the last 10 years. So to your question about ethics, this was a controversial analysis, right? So on one hand, people are very interested in representation by gender on the news. And for that reason, we were like, it seems like it would be worthwhile to put some data behind this. On the other hand, gender is far more complex than binary representations. And so we had to address the issue of, are we sort of promoting or propagating a notion of gender that is outdated and not accurate for some individuals? Because the only real, answer to how someone identifies about gender is to ask them, right? And we're using computer algorithms that are going based on looks.
Right.
So we had a bunch of discussions about this. And what we chose to do in this particular case was the site that we have online that anybody can use does not reveal any of those annotations. But in a scientific publication where we reported on some of those analyses.
And then there's a very careful method section where you say exactly how you did what you did and why the decisions were made.
And we tried to address some of that in the paper, right? So the basic thinking was that if these labels went out to the public, they could be misused. They could be misused because the computer could just in fact get it wrong. Or someone could not accidentally, purposely use a graph from Stanford, which seemed like it had some scientific merit to it, to espouse a viewpoint that was harmful for one of those individuals.
So this is a fascinating project, but I think I have to ask you about this issue of fake news and deep fakes, because you were literally watching the news for 30 years, 10 years on 3 networks. And in the future, there's a big worry, and you can tell me if this worry is overblown or not, about the ability of computational algorithms to create things that are not just entertaining, but are used for nefarious purposes of creating lies. And so what is what is your take on that threat and on the possibilities of mitigating that threat?
I agree that it is a completely legitimate threat. I think that people have been able to make fake images and fake videos for a long time. Go to the movies and you will see CG and it will be impressive.
Pretty impressive, yes.
And the thing that has changed is just the ease. The biggest thing that's changed is the ease in which you can make those fakes. And I think that is a concern. And I think we've seen plenty of evidence of technology being used to erode trust, or just basically bring disruption to everything, and so we don't know who to trust. I don't know if I have the best answer to that, other than all of us that are developing technologies in the space need to be mindful and thoughtful of why we are developing what we are doing. And that mindfulness involves talking to a lot of other people that may see implications of that are not within our community.
Yeah. That thanks for saying that. And that makes sense. We only have a few minutes left, and so I'm going to be a little bit popping around, because I also wanted to ask about the fact that cell phones are in the hands of literally billions of people, and many of the cell phones are generating large amounts of video. What kind of challenges or opportunities does that create for somebody like you who's creating these technologies to analyze visual data?
Okay. Well, from the perspective of my particular work, it's an opportunity. And it's an opportunity because the largest problem in computer graphics, and the folks, back at Pixar in the 90s will tell you this, all the way to present day, is creating the content that we want to render, right? And so historically, creating that content has been 3D modeling or painting, and then using simulation from first principles to make these images or make these animations. Now that there's a camera on every street corner in the world, everybody has amazing amounts of content in their own iPhone photos library. And so the algorithms are shifting a little bit. The algorithms are shifting to, if I want to make something new, how do I manipulate or collage or bring together the existing real world content that already exists out there, as opposed to how do I start from scratch?
Oh, interesting.
And in some ways, that's what a deep fake is. It's taking all of these images of a person or a thing and learning what they look like from a bunch of different angles so that we can synthesize novel ones. And to your conversation a second ago, that can be used for a lot of fun, useful purposes. And it can also be misused. And
so that's great. And so to finish, we have about 2.5 minutes, and I just want to finish up with you telling me, you are a highly trained engineer, and we've been talking about high level ideas, but this turns into software and hardware challenges. So can you tell me some of the things going on in your lab, some of the kind of deeper technical stuff that you're doing to address deficiencies in the technology as you see them?
Sure. One of about half my students in the lab are interested in improving our ability to analyze the content of images. For example, in the TV news project, someone came up to us a few months ago and said, can you show us what percentage of people are wearing masks on the different stations?
Ooh,
right?
Good one.
And it is frustrating how hard it is, or how long it takes to go from that person coming to me and asking me that question to a piece of software that you trust that can answer that at scale. And there really isn't a good reason why that should be the case. And I think that one half of our lab is trying to develop technologies to make that easier. And again, I say not just to detect faces, or sorry, to detect masks, but to actually know how well you're detecting the masks.
Right.
That's one area of research that some of my folks are working in. On the other side of the fence, in terms of topics that we haven't talked about, is computer graphics is now finding a huge role in simulating the world, whether it be from first principles or collaging all the images of the world in new ways to generate training data for all of these AI and machine learning algorithms that are so data hungry. So simulation is the mechanism to generate novel experiences for robots to perhaps get better at what they are doing.
Fascinating. So maybe the existing library of experiences to train a robot might not be sufficient. So you need to create many more scenarios so the robot can practice, especially perhaps scenarios that are dangerous and rare. Show them those so that they can get the performance that you're hoping for. Is that the idea?
And that's squarely in the breadbasket of computer graphics, right? In terms of generating believable, almost like the real world experiences. And that's a very hard problem, because we no longer have to trick a viewer into kind of thinking that the dinosaur is in the same room. We have to make sure that the statistical distributions of whether or not the person's going to cross the street match what those Waymo cars or something like that might see when they're driving around San Francisco.
A really fascinating way to end, because instead of graphics having their primary consumer be humans, there's now another consumer, and that consumer is other computers.
It's very likely that most images that are produced in the world a decade from now will not be seen by human eyes.
Thank you for listening to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. If you missed any of this episode, listen anytime on demand with the SiriusXM app.